Hello friends and neighbors. At the beginning of this year, I made a number of goals and resolutions for myself, and 3 of these involved reading. And I am pleased to announce that I have completed 1 of these 3. So let's not waste any more time, but get right to my book review of my very first full-length Dickens novel, Hard Times. After I read A Christmas Carol last year for my Books vs. Movies review, I decided I wanted to read more Dickens. But when I got this first full-length novel of Charles Dickens, I honestly wasn't sure what to expect. I knew that he could be rather wordy in his novels, but I also knew that he was considered one of the great English writers. And after reading Hard Times, I think I can see why. Yes, Dickens was paid by the word, and yes, Dickens novels tend to be very wordy largely because of this. But here's the thing about the wordiness of Dickens compared to the wordiness of, say, Tolkien. I actually enjoy reading this. Tolkien fans, please don't kill me. Dickens has a way with the English language. He has a way with words, and I just love the cadence and the rhythm and even the personality of the narrator. The narrator of this story has a distinct personality. And so you get a lot of sarcasm and irony and hyperbole and these wonderful, wonderful writing techniques. There were times in the reading of this novel that I actually laughed out loud. Hard Times follows actually a number of characters, but one of the main characters it follows is a schoolmaster and father by the name of Thomas Gradgrind. Gradgrind is a firm believer in the importance of facts. He believes that anything that is related to imagination or fancy or anything that is not strictly grounded in facts should be eliminated. He lives his life by this philosophy, he runs his school by this philosophy, and most importantly, he raises his children by this philosophy. And throughout the course of the story, we see the consequences of this philosophy. Now obviously there is a great deal of historical background and context that should be taken into consideration when reading this book, but I'm not actually going to cover any of that in this review because I want to determine whether or not this story is still relevant today. And even though it was written over a century and a half ago, I really think that it is. There are a lot of messages and themes associated with this novel, but one of the main ones is that of fact versus fancy. Which was kind of a big thing during the time, but it's still kind of a big thing today if you think about it. Whenever Gradgrind goes into one of his rants about facts, it seems thoroughly ridiculous, and yet we see schools that hammer facts upon facts upon facts on their students, and even creative expression is standardized. There's a songwriter by the name of Harry Chapin. You may have heard of him. His most famous song is Cats in the Cradle, but he also wrote a song called Flowers Are Red. I think that's what it's called. The song tells a story about a young boy in school who is drawing colors all over the paper, just scribbling colors all over the paper. The teacher asks him what he's doing, and he says he's painting flowers. And the teacher says, no you're not, because flowers are red and green. You must make flowers red and green. And she eventually punishes the child until he submits to her way of thinking. That's pretty much this book. Now the actual content of the book is really not subtle at all when it comes to driving this point home, but the structure of the book kind of is. It's divided into 3 parts. Part 1 is called Sowing, where we see Gradgrind sowing this philosophy into the lives of his children. The second part is called Reaping, and in this chapter we actually don't see Gradgrind until the very end. What we see instead are the events playing out from the end of Part 1 and the consequences of this philosophy as they play out in this section. And then at the very end, at the very last chapter of Part 1, that's when we see Gradgrind again. We see him having to finally come to terms with the consequences of having instilled this philosophy into his children. And then Part 3, Garnering, sees Gradgrind adjusting his philosophy, coming to terms with all the consequences and the things that have happened and so on. So the ending is not really what you would call happy. It's not really a downer so much, but it's not really uplifting either. In the end, there's really only one character who turns out as a happy, well-adjusted human being, and it's the character from the very beginning of the story who was the student that Gradgrind had to reprimand because she was too much of an advocate of fancy. That character is named Sissy, and I think I like her character about as much as Sarah Crewe from A Little Princess. I mean, I really like this character. In fact, as far as characters are concerned, this book presents us with some pretty interesting and yet universal characters. They're not terribly well developed in the end, but then they're not really supposed to be. They're simple enough in their characterization that we can relate to them and yet still be interested in them. We all know someone in our lives who is a Gradgrind, or a Sparsit, or, God help us, a Bounderby. Now, the book is not entirely without its problems, and probably the main one is that it can be a little hard to follow at times for 3 reasons. First, there is a great deal of historical context, but that problem can be easily solved by getting a copy of the book that has annotations and footnotes and so on, so that you can get that context pretty quickly. The second problem is that Dickens is one of those authors who, whenever a character has a speech impediment or speaks with a dialect, he likes to write the dialogue in such a way that reflects this dialect or this speech impediment. For instance, there's a character in the story who lisps, and so every time he speaks and uses the letter S, that letter is replaced with TH. And there are some authors like J.K. Rowling who can do this well, who can portray the dialect while still making it comprehensible. Dickens is not one of those authors. There were a couple of characters in this novel that I had a real hard time following, enough so that I actually had to look up portions of the plot synopsis online because I honestly just could not understand what this character was saying. And the third reason is that it is pretty wordy, and while those words are enjoyable to read, it's pretty easy to get caught up in the words so much that you kind of forget where and when you are. But if you can get past all that, this is still an excellent, excellent novel. On the worth meter, I would give this a worth owning new. And again, try to find a copy that has those annotations and footnotes. I use the Barnes & Noble Classics publication, but there might be one that's better. I don't know, I'm not really well versed in that sort of thing. But find one that has some sort of annotations and footnotes so you can get the historical context. And the book has been added to my favorites list, which means that in a year's time or more, I will be rereading it and giving you my perceptions and letting you know if it is still on the favorites list. It probably will be. And that does it for my first review of a Dickens novel. I do have 2 other Dickens novels at my disposal that I plan on reading and reviewing, so stay tuned for those. And until next time, this is Matt Guyan reminding you not to put peanut butter on pizza. It burns. Facts. That word is incredibly hard to say. Facts. Really? You're gonna go off on that sign-off after having reviewed a novel by Charles Dickens? You're going to sign off by telling people not to put peanut butter on pizza. I'm just a brilliant young man.